Hello, everybody. Um, Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the different lands in which we meet today. I'm in Naarm, Melbourne, and I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So welcome, everybody. On behalf of RMIT University, Curtin University, the Morning After Research Team, and the TikTok Cultures Research Network, I would like to welcome you to this symposium on TikTok and grief. My name is Larissa Hjorth, and I'm a digital ethnographer and socially engaged artist and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. The fellowship, The Morning After, explores how grief is shared in online spaces and how grief literacy might be shaped through digital and creative methods. So a few months ago, we all thought that TikTok was getting banned, and yet here we are, with TikTok's influence only continuing to grow. But beyond the dance trends and clever algorithms, the app has also become an unexpected space for grief and grieving, sometimes heartfelt, sometimes unconventional, sometimes a little messy. From sincere tributes to viral trends, TikTok is changing the way that people share, process, and engage with loss. This event brings together leading and emerging voices in social media research from across the globe. We will explore how platforms like TikTok are reshaping grief narratives, literacies, vernaculars, and creating meaningful communities. We will also consider some of the ways in which TikTok creates and curates effective witnessing, intimate publics, and grievabilities to some of the darker politics of grief as commodity and grief hijacking. We will learn about death humour, online mourning rituals, eco-grief, the politics of TikTok, and feminist perspectives. Some housekeeping. So just a few kind of logistic details before we get started. We have received about 200 registrations for today. So if you could all please keep your microphones, they should be on mute, but if you can make sure that they are muted. But we invite you to write any questions that you might have throughout the event in the little Q&A box that's down on the bottom, so that hopefully we can address them during the panel sessions. Also, a trigger warning. So today we are exploring grief as a cultural and social phenomenon, not as a clinical one. That being said, we know that grief and loss are very sensitive topics, and some of the content presented might bring up your own experiences with loss. So please take care of yourself while watching. You're welcome to take breaks as needed, and we will put some support resources in the chat for you. We want to create a space in which people feel respected, hold space for different ideas, and acknowledge that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. So, our first speaker and co-organizer needs no introduction as one of the world's experts on TikTok. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Crystal Abidin from Curtin University. Crystal is a director of the Influencer Ethnography Research Lab, founder of the TikTok Cultures Research Network, and editor-in-chief of Media International Australia. She is a digital anthropologist and ethnographer of vernacular internet cultures. She researches influencer cultures, online visibility, social media, popular cultures. So thank you. I'll hand over to Crystal.
Thank you so much, Larissa, and thank you everyone for having us. It's really nice to be able to partner with the Morning After team, and we at TCR and I'm excited to put this together. I have the pleasure of laying the lens, so to speak, on how we might want to approach TikTok and grief, or how we might want to survey the landscape of possibilities and how we can research this. So to begin with, I'm going to assume that not everybody is familiar with TikTok and start from the very beginning. Assuming you're picking up your phone for the first time, you might realize that the first way you encounter content on TikTok is not necessarily through searching for people you follow, through a hashtag, or through any other type of specific stream. Your first encounter with contents on TikTok is often through something we call the FYP or the For You page. And it works as a combination of a proprietary algorithm managed by TikTok that surveys your digital footprints, the references and the recommendations and your preferences you've input when you first entered and started your account, as well as how they deem contents to be trending and popular based on your specific geographical region. All this is to say that unlike many platforms, TikTok cultures can be highly local or even hyper-communal, meaning something that's trending in my area of TikTok, my TikTok neighborhood, so to speak, might never register on the radar of yours, even if we are similarly young Asian women spread across the world. So this is important for us to keep in mind because there is not one all-encompassing idea of what TikTok cultures are. And likewise, there's not one encompassing idea on what grief on TikTok may look like. Supposing we enter the second stage where you start to scroll, there might be different ways where you can identify grief on TikTok. The most common of these that we already are socialized to from other platforms are the uses of hashtags. For instance, hashtag grief, hashtag bereavement, hashtag loss, death, and the like. But on TikTok, the audio, the sound, the auditory experience is especially important and primal to the experience there. You might be familiar with the fact that lots of sounds, whether they're quips, sentences, catchphrases, conversations, or even music clips, often go viral on TikTok, and they serve as repositories or libraries for how users can interpret, remix, and readapt the original meanings into their own context. It is in this space where audio memes stand out as a defining feature of TikTok as compared to many other video platforms. For instance, lyrics of a very melancholic song, the tune of a wistful instrumental soundtrack, even dialogue that's originally lifted from sitcoms and comedy can be remixed for people to point to grief, bereavement, or loss through multimedia remix and creative adaptation. Finally, sometimes you just simply cannot escape what the platform wants you to see. Supposing you have never been interested in grief or bereavement or loss, but there might be world events happening all across the world, war, grief, landslides, and in the case of Australia right now, lots of disasters to do with the floodings. People might be expressing loss in all of these ways, and based on your geographical milieu, supposing if you're based in Australia or attached to parts of the Asia Pacific, these contents surface on your feed on the FYP under the proprietary algorithm's belief that it might be of interest to you. All this is to say, you might intentionally go seeking grief content on TikTok, or it might just land in your lap without trigger warnings, without any sentiment or desire of yours at all. So how do we make sense of this? Now, we found in our research so far that when we talk about grief and grief cultures, we have tended to focus mostly on communities. People who come together either because they share the same sense of loss, they have the same mechanisms of coping strategies, or perhaps they were involved in a very specific generational period of time where the grief literacies, registers, and vernaculars are shared. Let me give you examples. In the first instance, a lot of Facebook groups tend to be set up by people who have first experienced grief and then wanted to rally around communities around their experience. Parents who've lost children, bereavement groups of people who are about to lose a loved one to a prolonged illness. And they come together with very specific struggles that people in this sub-community might share. In the second example, we might see people come together because they've got a similar experience based on their profession or the way they curate their identities. For instance, folks who are here to provide therapy or encouragement, professional businesses who talk about bereavement, pet loss, the management of your remains, your rights, maybe even more ecological ways to deal with bodily remains. And in the third group, where we talk about these amorphous groups that come together, We might be more loosely then looking at people who are simply encountering grief in short stints and short bursts of time without really processing specific definitions of what is happening. They might perceive grief as the very small, minute sense of loss when a plant dies, but scrolling through your feed, you might then see a more heavy, extreme version of grief where someone is talking about the death of a loved one. This is not to say that grief is unequally valued, but in TikTok's algorithm of visibility, there are different types of moralities attached to these conversations. Sometimes there's even a bit of a competitive grieving ethic or ethos among competitors, where TikTokers might say, that's not real grief, mine is real grief. I'm closer to the event, you're less. Your pain only involves pets, mine involves humans. And we see a lot of these negotiations of who gets to grieve in the comment section. So today we're very lucky to have a whole spread of papers that allows us to look at all these different types of grief. But before I wrap up, let me give you just a few insights from some research that the Morning After team and the TikTok Cultures Research Network team have been looking into. We're seeing some trends in how grief has been narrated on TikTok. For one, bereavement and the loss of a loved one has often come out as personal diarying and vlogging. We see a lot of accounts focused on legacy creation, talking about what people want to leave behind, sometimes literally leaving behind on a tombstone a QR code so people can scroll through and look at their legacy, or other times leaving behind bits of themselves where their body might contribute nutrition to the growth of trees. Now, given that we're also speaking of TikTok, not all of these prolific grief accounts are necessarily influencers whom we can recognize as these stable online brands who are selling their personal narratives and building commercial identities. In fact, many of the most prolific grief accounts on TikTok are faceless. There are no personal stories, there's no identifiable information, but they curate contents that are so thematically coherent that people subscribe to them as you would a newsletter or a blog. On to the more cynical side, there are quite a few grief accounts on TikTok that are outrightly just peddling sales or ads, selling grief journals, affirmation cards, jewelry that you might use to incorporate a memento of a loved one. But there are also smaller accounts focused on subsets of grief, as we've mentioned before, loss of a loved one, whether a parent, a child, a partner, loss of non-human siblings, non-human actors, like your pets, plants, maybe grief even on a larger scale, like eco-grief in lieu of climate loss. In the age of mass war, destruction, and conflict right now, a lot of these accounts also talk about grief on a larger scale. A lot of political discussions about what is grievable in the words of lots of academic theorists, and in the words of philosophers who tell us that there is a different type of grievability aesthetics and permissions and hierarchies of whose lives are valued over others. But these are not new. We've seen this on the likes of Instagram, where we've had very popular hashtags like Pray for Paris, Pray for Brussels, so on and so forth, trend for a very long time. And even in those early days, in the 2010s, there are already conversations over what goes viral and what does not. All this is to say, a lot of grief on TikTok is platform specific by the design of the features and affordances, but the content, the narrations, the personality and the personability of the conversations are carried over from the time we turn to digital media to share everyday lives online.